Pajashik, welcome. Welcome to Indigital Insights. Monique Manach Indigenous, Kitigan Zibi and Dojaba. My name is Monique Manach, and I'm a member of the Algonquins of Barrier Lake. And today, we're honored to have Simon Brascoupé with us. Simon is an eminent Algonquin artist from Kitigan Zibi. And I'm really so thrilled that you agreed to talk with us today. And there are so many things that I want to know and learn. Where would you like to start?
Well, I guess top of mind, we always talk about artists, and I think in a indigenous context, it's different than a Western context. And some of the projects that I've done, like I did a paddle installation at Pimisi Station here in Ottawa, and there were like a little over 100 paddles, and they were painted by indigenous Algonquins, a lot of them from Kitigan Zibi. And my biggest hurdle was to convince them they were artists, And I said, well, how long have you been doing, sewing or beadworking or carving? And they'd be saying, oh, well, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, 60 years. And I said, well, you're an artist. Anyways, they got convinced. But also, I think that Indigenous art uh, has, there's many definitions of what is art, but I think from an Indigenous perspective, art is place-based. It's art. It comes from our territory. It's community based. That my work comes from the community, and a lot of the elders say, um, that they'll say, "Oh, that's not in our culture," or "This is in our culture." And I really believe that they want an authentic culture represented that gets passed on from generation to generation. And I try to do my best, but I'm sure I make a lot of mistakes. And and the same with my daughters who are artists. They work in the same kind of mode, and storytelling. There's layers of stories in artwork, and I have a great interest in Algonquin art history. Birch bark biting, basket making, canoe making, all the stuff that our ancestors did. And yeah, so I really call myself uh, a a kind of a community artist. I haven't really come up with a definition or a title, but anyway, so when people ask what you do, I'm an artist educator, and the I could go on for days about the fact that our art is holistic, uh, meaning it's spiritual, it's physical, emotional, mental, and I think all art has that holistic content to it, because people in the Western art world, when they look at art, we want to be surprised and you happy to look at the artwork, and the artist is communicating through their art the ideas that they have, and it's the same with Algonquin or indigenous art.
When you're saying cultural, but it occurs to me though that each artist would bring their own. Like we all see the world through different eyes,
Mm-hmm.
and each person would bring their own expression of the world to it, and then
Yeah,
that means there's more to teach the next generation.
yeah. Well, uh, one artist can't do it all, So we have these, like Albert Marshall has this idea of two-eyed seeing, but when you actually talk to him about it, he said it's multiple eye seeing. It's not just your view or my view. As a lot of people have different um, visions of the world, and they bring that kind of to that two-eyed seeing. And it's the same with art and artists, that each artist has their own story, but it's grounded in place. It's the territory that and the land that their ancestors come from is where the art comes from. So you'll see Algonquin artists doing beadwork, and you look at it that it's storytelling. There's teachings coming from one generation to another. You can imagine people sitting around beading and telling stories. And then also, we've got a lot of artists that are represent their art in different styles. And so some artists are very realistic art. So, but I feel like it's coming from the same place. They're not painting zebras or elephants. They're painting moose and deer and animals from our territory, and they've chosen that subject for a particular purpose.
When you talk about birch bark biting, 'cause I remember seeing that when we went to the National Gallery and they had that exhibit. To me, it's so incredible that you can take the birch bark and make how did you learn that? How did you learn how to do that?
I think it's intuitive. I I'm pretty sure my grandmother or my father said you can fold it and you can bite it and you can make images. And um, and I think that's basically how I've learned a lot of the uh, traditional teachings on doing things that way. Um, my dad, anyway. So uh, I started uh, getting interested in um, birch bark biting, and I, I'm certain there are people in at Kitigan Zibi, and I know in your community that do birch bark biting, but you get this storyline that it's a dead art or dying art, and uh, but it's still alive in our communities. But the National Gallery has a birch bark biting that I did on exhibit. I'm very proud of that. But it's exhibited along with other birch bark bitings that are like over 100 years old. And you look at it they look perfectly new. And uh, but when you think about it, the material is covered in microbials, like a little uh, insects or little animals that you can't see, and it keeps the birch bark from rotting, and so uh, uh, I've been told that the 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 bark is alive, and when we think about some a piece of bark taken off a tree and split into little thin pieces, you don't think about the birch bark spirit that it has, that it's alive, and we know that it's medicinal. You can make tea out of it. It'll get rid of your headache. But a lot of the biters that do birch bark biting will say um, the not only is the bark alive, but when you're actually biting it, you use your eye teeth or the canine teeth, and you're biting, but you can't actually see it what you're doing. And so a lot of the birch bark artists say it's the creator is coming through you and helping you do the biting. So you're never absolutely certain what you're doing. So when you open it up, you get surprised. Like, whoa, did I do that? And I just did a workshop last week with students, and they were all going, "Whoa, look at this!" And so that you can teach them how to do circles, little insects, flowers, suns, and people get great enjoyment from it. And there's stories that come with it. I think the one of the basic stories is that you're creating four directions, the sacred directions, and I usually talk about how humans divide up the world. It and that is the sun rising, you're looking east, the sun sets in the west, your arm, um, your left arm's going north, your right arm's going south, and it's a way of situating ourselves in the world that's around us. And the birch bark biting helps us understand that, at least in a visual way, that you've got these sacred directions, and then also teachings. So you got four quadrants that teaches about going through life. Starting as a child, youth, adult, elder.
Yeah, and it's so intricate. My poor cousin, I said, could we do some birch bark biting? But I guess you have to gather the birch in gather the bark in the spring when it holds more
Yeah,
moisture.
yeah,
Well, there we were in July. This poor woman, Mary, Mary Jerome, she's trying to, and it wasn't coming out. And she said, it's not working, it's not working. Finally, she said, Monique, we gathered this in the spring. Oh no. Well, let's make baskets. But
you, you can soak it,
yeah,
but
yeah,
you have to re-soak it to do it. But yeah, she's right.
we were soaking the spruce roots.
So there's a lesson there for you. Right? That things are done at the right time in the right season and sequence.
Yeah, her work too is just so like how they make the flowers and the insects and like it's just for me I don't know, it's just fascinating. I can't imagine how you could do it. Like, do you know, like how do you know, is there a pattern that if I do it like this and then you do it, I guess it's repetition, I suppose, that once I look at it, okay. I remember as a kid, um, my brothers were of an age, we were young, and we'd go up to Rapid Lake for the summers, and some of the girls were coming around and look, birch bark biting, and they were like, oh, and my dad's like, no, 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 no,
Yeah,
different lesson that day.
yeah. Keep you out of trouble. Yeah.
Yeah, he's trying to.
But it is social. You're talking about it being a social thing. I think that it's part of the way of bringing people together, but also to talk. We have any excuse to talk and then eat. Those are two important things, and birch bark biting can do that. But also it uh, enables us to start telling stories. You just told me one about your dad.
When we were making the baskets afterwards, the way that it fascinates me as well, the way they create the images, because you would think they would just scrape out the image, but it's the reverse.
Yeah,
That they scrape away everything around the image and leave the image,
yeah.
and that boggled my mind when I was growing up. I just, how do you? I couldn't imagine it. I don't know why, but I just.
Well, I guess it's the artist's imagination and mind. What I like about that is that uh, myself and my daughters have combined those two art techniques. So one is birch bark biting, and then the other is a stencil. And so the stencil would be used to create the same image or a similar image on one side of the basket, and you scrape it. You scrape it, sgraffito. You're scraping away the dark to the light, and then uh, and you've got this silhouette. But then you repeat it on the back, the same artwork. Often it was done like that, and I think the reason is that uh, Algonquins or Anishinaabe are interested in the duality of life. I mean, we've got two hands, and that duality teaches a lot of things. For example, um, you, you can pick medicine. So I would go picking medicine with my dad and he would say, never pick the first plant that you see. It could be the last. So you go to the next one, and then when you pick the plant, you leave tobacco, and say a prayer, giving thanks to the plant for the medicine, and then he would say, you also have to be careful because there's other plants that look like that same plant, that medicine. But then that gets back to this idea of place, that the plants grow in a particular place. You know where that medicine um, grew last year. You go to the same second place and pick it. But everything that I've been taught has had this balance, to it. And I think that in one way, that's kind of the secret of Anishinabe's way of living sustainably in this world. So you don't pick the first plant. You have to weigh everything you do in terms of, is this sustainable? Am I doing what's sustainable? And so you got that duality there, that balance you're always thinking about. And the other thing is you don't you only take what you need. And my dad would always he was upset at one of his brothers, and every once in a while the story would come up, the same story. My one of my uncles had shot a bear cub. He goes, I don't know why he shot that bear cub. He didn't need to. Blah 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 blah. But he was telling me, you know, show some respect. I don't even know if my uncle had killed another bear, the bear cub. But the so only take what you need, uh, and then use everything. Um, you're obliged to show that respect, to use everything. But of course, you can't use everything. There's stuff that's left over, and you know this, that you give it back. Sometimes it's to the water or to the land, and that it's being used by another being. It could be other fish or other animals can use it. Um, yeah. So we see that in the art. Um, but I was that's a long way to get to the point that I was trying to make. That the birch bark biting, uh, we've created these contemporary images using birch bark, and so that we digitize the bitings, and then using a stencil technique to create uh, a like a pattern behind behind the image. And so, if our ancestors had, well, one of these days I'm going to be an ancestor, but if our ancestors had access to contemporary printing techniques that we do, that's what they would do, to create these images.
I've wondered about that when you say that if they, I used to work with Jacob Owati, and um, he lived a long time in the bush with his grandmother Lena up in the territory, and and he would talk about how, um, for one thing, he would talk about how when you're making a canoe, or when you're learning biology, you're learning math, art, you're learning all these different things. But he also talked about how, um, he said we use all these different materials to create art. And he said, and whether you're using a pen or whether you're using, a piece of charcoal, it's it's the interaction between you and your environment, between you and the land. That's the important thing. And how, he says we have all these new tools and we're trying to come up with all these new words for microwave and for engine and all that kind of thing. He says, but at the same time, these are still tools to um, help us live in this world, and to feed our families and to express ourselves. And I've wondered about that, like how, um, they say some of Norvell Morris's earliest work were done on like plywood
And Birch Park.
and yeah.
Yeah.
And they would say up in Cocomville, that hunting camp they had up there, they would say an Indian is never stuck.
Yeah.
I love that. I try to use that. Well, there's got to be something around here that I can,
Yeah.
make shift to do what I need to do, kind of thing. And I wondered about that with different with now that we're using all these new digital tools. How do you use those tools in a way that expresses your work?
So I can use the example of the birch bark biting, but I'm going to use one of my daughter's. Uh, um, One of the projects one of my daughters did was she did a birch bark biting, digitized it, and then did a stencil that became kind of a layer onto the biting. So they're both digital. Uh, but how do you make that image 30 feet by 20 feet? So with the technical vector kind of software, it can go infinite in size. Uh, I'm sure there's limits, but so she took that image and it was done in a software that could just infinitely get bigger and bigger. So she wouldn't have been able to do the. Uh, it's basically a print that is on a piece of canvas that is 20 feet high and 30 feet wide. And so the technology enables you to do things that you wouldn't have been able to do. Well, you could have done it in the past, but what you would have had to do was um, project it. Like take a slide and then project it, and then paint it. But this way is another way to do it. Um, so I think, and there's a lot of young artists that are doing it that way. You can one of my other daughters uses um, a tablet, and then you get a pen, you got a special pen, and you can draw on the tablet these images, and then you can color them in and do things with it. So one of my daughters does that. I think our ancestors would have taken a birch bark, uh, thin sheet of birch bark, cut out an image out of it, and then that image would have gotten passed down from one generation to another, saying, uh, "This is the a stencil that your great grandmother used to make images on birch bark baskets." So it can get passed on, and the proof of that is that there's tons of birch bark cutouts from Kitigan Zibi at the Museum of History in Gatineau. And then there's stories with it. So um, we've got if you go to um, Bon Echo Park west of Ottawa, there's I think it's one of the world's largest amount of pictographs. And one of the images is of a bear, and then the bear, there's little footprints on the bottom of the bear, and folks at Kitigan Zibi will, when you talk about it, they'll say, "Oh, I know the story to that one." And the story is, even though the bear is large, it walks softly on the land, and the bear is teaching us how to live sustainably, on the on the earth. And and so and then usually I'll come back and say, "Oh, we were out fishing with my dad and my brothers, and there was we saw we thought we saw a moose coming down the side of a hill. You know, this big moose with its antlers, and we got closer, and it was actually a bear. It was a bear going down, like I don't know what it was doing, and and then my dad said, "Oh, if you watch the bear and it gets cut." It'll go to a like a pine tree, you know, the sap on a pine tree, and it'll put the sap on the cut to heal the cut because it kills the sap will kill the germs or viruses that might be in that cut. And and usually when I tell that, somebody else will say, another indigenous person will say, "Oh, we use that all the time." You know, they use it like cough medicine or put it on the cut or make tea out of it. And so this kind of the stories get they don't get bigger, and but they just kind of spread out. And I think the indigenous people love to hear what other cultures do. You know.
Absolutely. I remember gathering spruce gum for Lena. She
Hmm.
had she had a bad cough, so she sent us all out to gather spruce gum, and we all came back with her. And then I don't know if she put it in the water, but she boiled the water, and she had the steam, and she was breathing it in to
Yeah.
help clear her lungs. Yeah, we have a story about the bear, about how it taught us, like, about medicine. Anything a bear can eat, we can eat. That kind of thing, and how the skeleton looks like a human being.
A lot of my images include bears, and I my my daughter one of my daughters was pregnant, and she said, "I want to." I want to have an Algonquin or a Anishinaabe name for this baby. And so I said, "Oh, okay, I can do that." I had no idea what I should have came to visit you, but a friend of mine who was Cree said, "You're going to dream it. You're going to dream the baby's name." And so I had these dreams, and uh, when when you go up to Kitigan Zibi, there's these rock outcrops, and I would dream that I climbed up top of the rock outcrops, and you know how the rocks are nice and smooth, and anyway, so the images of a bear, a mother bear would come out of the rock, and another image of a baby bear would come out of the rock, and so I had a few of those dreams, and then my uh, the 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 week that my daughter was due, I was in Toronto, and I just we were opening a meeting, and there were elders were saying prayers, and I had my eyes shut, and I could see the bear image come out of the rock, and then the baby bear come out of the rock, and then but this time it started spinning, and it turned black, and I went, "Oh, that can't be good," And so I got a little worried, and then I forgot about it. There was still saying prayers, and that same thing happened again. The bear image, mother bear image came out of the rock, and the baby image, and they started spinning. And this time it turned white, and uh, so the prayers ended, and then I got a text a few minutes later saying that um, my daughter had the baby, uh, and uh, and when I went to Ottawa that night, and she said, "Oh, the baby's head got stuck," and it was a new doctor. The new doctor was saying, "Oh, we might have to operate," and then and a few minutes later, the head came unstuck, and my daughter said she looked out the window, and it was just like white. It had the snow squall. And but in the morning, I had asked a couple of Cree elders, friends of mine, and that could they give the baby the name, um, and they said, yeah, we can do that. Well, we're going to name it. You know, outside today it snowed. It snowed in Toronto, and you dreamt about these bears. We're going to call it polar bear. And the elder that named him said, "That's my name." Her name was Polar Bear, and so that's what my grandson's name became. So if you want it to snow this time of the year, you can get him to wish for snow, and it'll snow.
Do you call them that in Algonquin, or do you call them?
It it's in Cree. It's what I think it's Wagush. Well, what I found out was each community, like each Algonquin community, will have different words for things, and my dad would go, "They're wrong," it's this way. You know
Well,
what that's like, and I think it's important. You want to keep your traditions alive, and so you got to kind of stick to it.
exactly. Even between Rapid Lake and it's a different dialect in
Yeah,
Kitigan Zibi, and I know they have a different long word for moose. It's like the animal that eats the grass out of the water, kind of
yeah.
thing. Uh,
Well, we usually shorten. I think words get shortened. It's like in English, and
you had mentioned those the Pimacy exhibit. There's two things I want to ask you. First of all, with the artists on that exhibit, they're all Algonquin.
yeah,
Did they did which communities did they come? Did they come from Kitigan Zibi or?
Pimisi, and people that were spread out here in Ottawa. There were Algonquins here in Ottawa. So, and it took about 2 years to go around to do it all because we did workshops, and the workshops were really moving because people would things, paint their paddles purposefully, and sometimes it was in honor of uh, a relative or a grandmother, something somebody had passed. There was one family that talked about their work, and they had been taken to residential school, and they revitalized their art in their family because as kind of resistance to colonialism, and they were saying that was part of their healing process that they were going through. So we got a lot of those stories. One person wasn't used to a brush, so we had brushes. He used a toothpick to paint. It was pretty detailed. But people were painting on animals, uh, birds, stories that meant something to them.
It means something personally, or it comes from family,
Yeah.
or community. There's that representation of those stories. I was also wondering about that Wayfinder project.
So the wayfinding is a city of Ottawa, and it was that one took like, because COVID was kind of in the middle of it. It took 10 years from beginning to end, and we're still um, installing uh, the wayfinding symbols in the region. And I'm going to one at the end of the month, the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario. I think that's who it was. Anyways, we had the Governor General go to one installation, but so the the animals there's animals around the outside of it. I think there's like 20 plus animals, and I just asked elders, what do you think should be on that uh, on the wayfinding symbol, and so that's what was each. I stopped asking when I thought these animals are going to be like so tiny, they're going to be dots, and then so at KZ, that they're always interested in canoes. So there's canoes in there. There's the Algonquin kind of canoe that you know the with the water symbol on the canoe that's popular up in uh, your community, and then the colors and there's animal paw prints in it, and that came from Pikwakanagan. You know, they were saying that's what we would like. You know, and if you look on their community website, you'll see their this teaching there. Um, and and I think what what I took away from that particular teaching, like these symbols um, are kind of telling the story of the present, you know. And what they were saying is that we have to learn our language, we have to be strong, we have to learn from the land, and that's what I got from Pimisi. And then uh, KZ Kitigan Zibi was interested in in the canoe image, you know, and then animals, different animals, and but in the center is a moose, and there's a couple little birds in it, and that's a story my dad told me. It's one of these true stories, you know, like the stories that um, are old, that get passed on from generation to generation, and then there's other stories that are family stories. Anyway, so him and one of my uncles were up in the park hunting moose, and this one uncle would always tell me, if you see birds, you know, like bluebirds, the ones that eat meat, you can and you can't find a moose, you ask them to find you a moose. Anyway, so they were up in the park, and uh, the my there were a couple of wasajuks, you know, these kind of whitish looking birds, and my uncle asked him, go find us a moose, and we'll be both eating meat tonight, you know. And so my dad and my uncle, I could just imagine them sitting there in their truck, eating bologna sandwiches, talking about what great hunters they are. And anyway, so my dad said, and my dad was not the kind of person that would exaggerate anything. He would always tell you the truth, you know. And and so he says that at the end of the day, uh, over the hill come these two birds, and following it is a moose, you know. And so that's what that moose design is in the middle of, and I think it just illustrates that uh, Anishinaabe, indigenous people, are really connected to the world around them in ways that I think our kind of modern mind find mysterious, but to them it wasn't. It's not mysterious, you know. And my dad would he had a his aunt lived here in Ottawa. She's since passed, but you know, he would take the liver, and uh, it would always get delivered to his aunt, my great aunt here in Ottawa, and so it just got shared, you know. And you'd look at my dad's freezer, there'd be nothing in there. You
Yeah. 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 It's just, I remember being at my grandparents, and a truck would pull up, and there'd be a moose in the back. And so everybody, you know, they'd call them, my brothers especially, "Oh, come on, everybody," you know, and they'd move the moose off the truck, and then they'd start butchering it. And then they would all just get, you know, in no time at all.
know,
And they'd
they were
always be,
gone.
who's getting the hide, you know.
Yeah, right. Well, today it's you know, the hides are being used more.
You do a lot of workshops here, eh, in Ottawa? A lot of teaching.
Well, I do. I've done a lot of birch bark biting workshops, and I did one at the National Gallery. It was 500 people. We had. Can you imagine how much birch bark we had to get? And it was like a Thursday evening, and that it was just tons of people. Anyway, so it was quite interesting because people, everybody, no matter what your age, can engage in it. And they, uh, I got, and you always run into somebody that's really interesting. There was a couple of people there from northern Russia. And what they were saying is that in their communities, they, and she had barrettes made out of birch bark, you know, and they were beautiful. They were kind of layered, um, and she said that they, in her community, they use birch bark all the time.
That's something I noticed with Latin America. There was, or South America, or even like in Mexico and whatnot. There was a few of them that would come up to Coconville sometimes, and some of the stories that they would tell us were like spot on to some of the stories that I had been taught
Yeah.
in the community. And the fact that the stories were so similar, it kind of, when you think about the thousands and thousands of miles between the communities. Oh, I wanted to ask you about that birch bark basket too, the one that's over in Gatineau.
So that was interesting. I think that all these public art works uh, didn't really weren't I didn't come up with, oh, we got to do a birch bark basket for this or a moose here, that sort of thing. And the same with the wayfinding symbol. It really comes from the community. So the birch bark basket, the often if I start a project, I'll meet with the elders at Kitigan Zibi and tell them what I'm up to, and then they talk about it. But in the case of the basket, the city of Gatineau asked the elders to develop an idea of what they wanted to see. So it wasn't like a visual idea, but it was sort of like they'd like to see Algonquin women, maybe in a canoe, and animals, and something that represents our culture, you know. And so that's where that came from. So they didn't say, "I want you to do this gigantic birch bark basket." Um, so I designed a, a birch bark basket with these different images on it. There were three women in canoes with their children. Then there's that bear story that's uh, even though the bears may get walk softly on the earth. And then there's a moose. Uh, at Bon Echo, there's an image of a moose, a baby moose, and a mother moose, and there's a connection, like a dot connection. So that then there is uh, there's a beaver, because our territory is kind of created by the beaver, or, over the centuries, and a wasayjuk, uh, and then that ridge of waves that you see on birch bark baskets and canoes, part of it. Yeah, and so that was the idea, and it actually looks like a gigantic birch bark basket. Yeah,
Well, I want to thank you so much, Chimigwich,
yeah,
for being with us here
yeah,
today, into us and telling us about your art and your family. And I think it's so important, the work that you're doing, and the way you're passing down the knowledge to the next generations. Thank you,
yeah.
Kachimi.
My pleasure. Thank